What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how I painted my Junkforce Halfling Admiral. I've got the colors and materials up on the screen, so if you want to give the video a pause, you can note those down before we jump right on into the tutorial. And do note that for this model, I am using Brokhyr Ironmaster from the Votann range. This also doubles as a great tutorial for how to paint some of your Votann heroes as well. So the prep for this model, nothing really fancy. Built it as is, although I did some modifications. So I tweaked his right arm because he's supposed to be holding a gun upright. I found the gun a little too sci-fi, so I just used a bit from the Halfling Blood Bowl team. A bit of a bandaged arms, like he's grabbing his side of the jacket. And then I did a head swap just for a bit of that scale. I'm not using dwarves, halflings, but otherwise, stock model. You can see I've added a few bits for some pistols and stuff like that. But yeah, not much. That's pretty much it for the prep. I will be painting this in sort of a grungier, more wasteland feel. So it's not going to be as clean as the Games Workshop Votann models are, but I really like the colors that they used on the Brokhyr Ironmaster, in particular the sort of off-white armor with that variety of brown tones. So I'm going to be following that as a general basis. So if you're painting Votann, you can definitely follow along and paint your own Brokhyr with these techniques and recipes. I'll prime the model with some Vallejo Surface Primer Black, and then we'll dive right on in. I'm going to start with an Airbrush Basecoat of very dark brown from AK, and I'm just going to apply a coat over the entire model. The goal here is to get a solid base coat of brown. I use a lot of warm brown tones for the entire model, and it'll help to do this step with the airbrush just to be a little bit more efficient. From there, I'm going to take some Tenebrous Gray, and I'm going to start to paint over any areas that are going to be green or dark green. So I'm looking at the fatigues, the chest, and the armor plating on the boots, as well as the knee pads. From there, I'm going to start mixing in a bit of gunship green in the Tenebrous Gray. And for this, I'm targeting the fatigues or the undersuit, so the areas underneath the chest, as well as the pants that he's wearing. I end up taking this to about a 50-50, 60-40 green to Tenebrous Gray mix. The goal is to keep it similar to the armor, but darker to have a bit of that contrast. From there, I'll go right into pure gunship green, and I'll apply a base coat to all of the armor elements, making sure to leave Tenebrous Gray showing in all of the crevices and armor plate separation. From there, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of green sky into the gunship green to form my highlights. I'm going to do a couple of transition steps between the two colors, but I'm not really focusing too much on super smooth blends. I want to just work the armor up relatively quickly all the way to pure green sky, because I go back in afterwards with a few glazes of the gunship green to smooth things out. My final highlight is with APC Interior Light, and I'm targeting the uppermost portions of the armor along with the raised edges. I don't want to use too much of this all over, so I want some nice contrast between the highlights and the shadows. Once that's done, I'll go in with some black red along with a pluck foam or sponge on my tweezers, and I'll do the chip weathering. So here I'm just lightly dabbing onto the armor plates wherever there is going to be battle damage or wear and tear. And this is also why I didn't bother doing super smooth blends, because the chip weathering, along with some of the oil washes we do later on the figure, do hide a lot of those imperfections and roughness. Once I add the chips, I'll go back in with that APC Interior Light and just apply some edge highlighting to the larger chips. To paint the white armor, I'm going to start with a base coat of medium sea gray. You'll want to make sure that you do a couple of thin coats to build up a nice even base coat. You may want to even start with a bit of a darker gray if you find that this is a little bit too thin for you. My next highlight step is going to be with warm gray, and I want to apply a few thin coats to build this color up. For all of white armor, and indeed whenever you're painting anything that's white or off-white, you want to make sure that your paints and your layers are nice and thin to avoid any chalkiness or texture. From warm gray, I'll start to mix in progressive amounts of pale sand And I'll just keep doing the same. Lots of thin layers, lots of progressive highlights to slowly transition up to a nice, clean, pale sand highlight. And now my final highlight is with pure white. I'm going to target this on the uppermost raised parts of the armor, as well as the sharpest edges. For me, I find that a lot of white lives in the midtones, and so I don't use a lot of white too often. Much like with the green armor, I'll go back in with that black red, do the sponge weathering, the chipping, and then I'll highlight back up with pure white. For the purpose of the recording, I ended up doing it in 2 separate stages, but to be more efficient, you could do the green armor and the white armor first before doing the chip weathering for everything all at once. With some IDF Modern Gray, I'm now going to start to base coat the interior of the jacket. I want something that's a bit of like a khaki tone, and so I'm going fairly bright with this, but not bright enough to compete with the white armor. Once I've got a nice even base coat of the Modern Gray, I'm going to start to mix in some of this sort of desert sand color. And you can see that I'm just being very sketchy with my layers. I'm focusing more on the texture of the color as opposed to perfect smoothness. And then what I do afterwards is go back in with some Tenebrous Gray mixed into that Modern Gray. And I'll apply glazes back into the mid and shadow tones, add a bit more depth, nuance, get some of that purple in there, and smooth out that roughness. With some black red, I'm going to apply a base coat to the outer part of the jacket. And I'm just going to be very liberal with this, cover everything. From the black red, I'll start to mix in medium rust and apply my highlights. Much like with the interior, I'm not worrying too much about smoothing my blends, but I'm using a lot of short cross-hatching brush strokes to imply a bit more of a worn leather texture to the jacket, and using that to sort of simulate a bit more of a cracked and worn surface. What I'm going for is a cracked and old worn leather jacket, so I want more of a reflective quality to the material. I'll mix a 50-50 mix of the black red and the Tenebrous Gray, and I'll start to glaze in the mid and shadow tones. Just like with the interior of the jacket, this will help to smooth out some of those transitions and bring in some of that purple into the mid and shadow tones. And then I'll follow that up with some glazes of pure Druchii Violet. I'll target this into the deeper shadows, once again, just to add a bit more of that more saturated purple color into the shadow tones. With leather brown, I'm now going to apply my first highlight onto all of the leather pouches and straps. I want to keep some of that very dark brown from my Airbrush Basecoat in the deepest shadows and crevices, but otherwise I target a lot of the broad mid-tone areas. I'll then use World War I French brown and apply a highlight to the leather elements, and this brings a nice saturated orange tone, before finishing off with some final edge highlights with tan earth. And I'll also use this on some of the buckles and belts to add some more chips and scratches to get that cracked leather feel like with the jacket. To base coat the silvers, I'm going to start with Scale Colors Black Metal. I'm just going to apply a liberal base coat into even all of the crevices. From there, I'll highlight straight with Heavy Metal. I'll make sure to pick out all of the raised areas, leaving any of the crevices in the black metal base coat. From there, I'll use Games Workshop's Known Oil, and I'll apply a targeted glaze / shade. So rather than do a sort of fire and forget method of applying it over all of a surface, I'll target specific areas to apply a limited application of the shade or the wash before going back in and cleaning it up. What you want to avoid is having the Known Oil pool and dry on flat surfaces, which ends up staining and making the metal feel dark and unpolished. And then finally, I'll go back in with Vallejo Airchrome and apply my sharpest edge highlights on a lot more of the raised prominent areas. I'm going to start painting the bandages and some of the burlap sacks and sleeping bags. Start with a base coat of graphite, and then following up with a wash of Tenebrous Gray. Nice and diluted, but dark enough to sort of pick out those recesses and crevices and basically just apply a few coats to add a bit of definition. From there, I'll mix up a 50-50 mix of graphite and Scale Colors Thar Brown. and I'll apply a base coat over all of the bandages and on the sack, leaving the deepest shadows and crevices in that gray mix. And then I'll work my way up to pure Thar Brown. My next highlight color will be with Mojave White, and I'm going to use this color fairly sparingly. The brighter you go with these bandages with the Thar Brown, the closer you get to the white armor. So you want to make sure that you're only picking out the brightest elements and not applying it over all of the bandages. In particular, with this final highlight of White Sands, I'm mainly focusing on edges here now, because again, White Sands is very close to, it's like an off-white, and too much of it makes the bandages look too similar to the armor. To paint the skin, I'm going to start with a base coat of Scale Colors African Shadow. And then to highlight, I'm going to start mixing in progressive amounts of base flush. The goal is to get to pure base flush, so I'm not going to mix in too many steps. I think I start with a 50-50 mix, and then I go straight to pure base flush. And with a combination of paint dilution and then some glazing and feathering, I create some smoother transitions. But the goal is to basically have pure base flush over a lot of the mid-tones of the skin. From base flush, I'm going to do the exact same thing, working my way to pure beige red. Depending on how much you dilute your paint and how you can build your layers up, you may want fewer or more intermediary steps, but the end goal is still the same. You want to be working up to pure beige red, especially on the forehead. I want a big separation between the front and the sides of the head, so you'll notice that the front has a lot of beige red, whereas the side does not. My final highlight will be a 50-50 mix of beige red and Moonray Flush. And for this, I'm really focusing on the front of the head, in particular areas like the brow, the eyebrows, the nose, nostrils, and the cheekbones. And once I'm done highlighting the skin, I'll go back in with glazes of violet red. And with this color, I'm mixing it to a watercolor consistency. The goal is to shade and nuance, in particular features like the temple, the sides of the head. We're looking at the sides of the nose and around the eye sockets. The goal with this color is to smooth out some of those transitions and add a bit more warmth and nuance into those mid and shadow tones. With the watercolor mix, it's fairly thin, so you can build up quite a few coats to get a nice, softer transition. To paint the hair, I'm going to start with a base coat of World War I French Brown, and I'm going to apply it over all of the hair, leaving only the deepest folds and shadows in our very dark brown base coat. My next highlight is with number 6 Earth Yellow, and it's at this stage now where I'm going to start to pick out some of the more prominent features of the hair, like the front, the bangs. Not really bangs, but we'll call them bangs. The next highlight step is with Sahara Yellow, doing the same thing, picking out more prominent features and strands of the hair. And then, where necessary, I do a bit of glazing to create a bit of a softer transition, in particular on the top of the head. And then my final highlight is a mix of Sahara Yellow and Pale Sand. And for this, I'm really only targeting the front elements and the front edges of the hair. I find that too much of this color pushes the hair too much into a sort of a pale desert yellow color. So I use this mix sparingly. To paint the eyes, I'm going to start with a base coat of Tenebris Gray, using a very thin brush and a diluted mix. I'll fill in the eye socket. I'll go in with some Scale Colors White Sands, which is effectively an off-white, and we'll paint in the white of the eyeball. And be careful to leave a bit of that Tenebris Gray black lining around the eye. We're finishing up with some Tenebris Gray dots to make the pupils. An easy trick to stop the model from looking cross-eyed is to actually have his eyes or his gaze shifted slightly to the left or the right. If he's not looking forward, it's a lot harder to get that cross-eyed mistake feel. With some reddish black, I'm now going to start to paint the handles of his hammer, as well as some of his knickknacks on his belt. I'll follow it up with a highlight of wine red, and I'm going to do this highlight onto each of the individual segments. The next two highlights are probably the most tedious parts of it, as you have to be really careful to leave that reddish black lining in between each of the different segments. It's a lot of work, it's a little bit time consuming, but I think that the end result is definitely worth it, and it helps to make that sort of detail element pop. You can see I'm doing the same thing with Carmine, focusing on each of the individual segments, and then using a bit of feathering to create a bit of a transition from the front to the back of the handle. I'll highlight each of the segments with dead red. Again, tedious, but I think the end result is definitely worth it. The hammer handles definitely pop. I'm going to apply a stronger highlight on the top two edges, a softer one on the leading front edge, and then a very diluted, very soft one on the bottom back edge to simulate a primary light source versus a reflected light source. And then finally, I'll go back in with some Vallejo game color. This is the Evil Red color from the new game color range. With a watercolor consistency, like with the violet red on the skin, I'm going to apply some glazes onto the mid and shadow tones of the handles, and this will help to smooth out the transitions, knock back some of the harshness, and add a bit more richness to the mid and shadow tones. And then finally, I'm just going to do a two-tone gray highlight onto the rocks. I used ash gray and graphite. With the graphite, I do pick out some of the details and add a bit of texture for a bit more information. In between the ground texture paste I apply, along with the tufts and the weathering powders, you won't see most of this anyways, so I didn't spend too much time on this. For a filtering step, I'm going to go back in with some burnt sienna oils. If the tube has a white box at the top, it indicates that it is a fairly translucent mix, and so I know that when I dilute this into a wash, it's going to dry with a fairly transparent finish, and I'm able to build up a soft filter as opposed to a more opaque finish. So using a synthetic brush and mineral spirits, I create a nice wash that I then apply to a lot of the crevices, the recesses, and generally anywhere where I want to add a bit more nuance and a bit of filtering. I love the way that this sort of finishes and ties everything into a very dusty, hazy environment. The burnt sienna has this sort of yellowy orange tone or quality that just unifies everything and adds just that extra layer of visual interest. You can do this wash with an acrylic, but what I like about using oils is that even once they're dry, you can go back in and reactivate them with a clean brush and some mineral spirits. So what I do is I just apply this very liberally, and then afterwards I can go back in with a clean brush and some mineral spirits, and I can clean up areas where the wash is too heavy or where I find that I don't want to have that filter as strong. I can go and remove some of that paint afterwards. Oils have a very long working time, and they're a great material to use over acrylics. Do the basing texture, I'm using some desert texture paste from Vallejo. I'm using just an old sculpting tool to apply a big chunk of it, and then because this is an acrylic material, you can go in with some water and a brush to dilute and to push the material around. So you can see where I need to push the material around the painted elements. I go in with a brush, and it's very easy to work. Once that's cured, I'll apply a few tufts with Army Painter's Winter Tuft. The first thing I want to do is just dry fit them, figure out the exact placement. You can see here that I'm sort of just fiddling about with where exactly I want the tufts to be. Because of the size of them and the model itself, I want to make sure that it's not obscuring any important detail, and it balances on the base in terms of areas of busyness with areas of open contrast. I know it's a minor thing, but these are the little things that, for me, can really elevate a model. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I'll just apply a dab of super glue and then affix the tufts on with that. You want to make sure that you give the super glue sufficient time to cure and dry before moving on to the weathering powder step. Speaking of weathering powders, I'm going to be using Vallejo's Dark Yellow Ochre, and I'm applying a heavy application to the base. The goal here is to focus a lot on those deep crevices and shadows, in particular around the tufts, and then wherever the model comes into contact with the ground, I guess. Where I apply to the actual model itself, I'm a little bit more gentle with the application, largely because of how difficult weathering powders are to remove after you've applied them. So very often I'll apply a little bit, evaluate, and then if I feel like I need more, I'll apply more rather than applying a heavy coat first. realize it's too much, and then going to try and remove it with a damp brush, you end up just ruining the finish. It's one of those things where less is more, and you can build up your coats far more easily than you can remove them. So here you can see that my application on the model is a lot softer than when I'm applying it to the base. And what I'm doing is I'm applying a heavy coat to the base first, and then once most of the powders are off of the brush, I do a little bit of a dusting on the model before grabbing more pigments and doing it again, base and then onto the model. Once I'm happy with the finish and the application, I'll apply a liberal coat of mineral spirits with a spritzer bottle, and this will help to seal or fix the powders to the base and protect it from handling during gameplay. That'll take about 45 minutes to an hour to fully evaporate. Once it's dry, I paint the base trim black, and I varnish the model with Mr. Hobby's Super Clear, which is a matte varnish, and it helps to just remove a lot of the shine and the gloss, in particular from the non-oil wash, the Druchii Violet wash, as well as some of that oil finish from the burnt sienna. And that wraps up this model. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.